CFS Alert. I'm in Torrance, California, just adjacent to Los Angeles, with Dr. John Chia, one of the great names in research on chronic fatigue syndrome, and we're very honored and delighted to have him on the program today. Dr. Chia, you have a happy story to tell. That is, your son had CFS and now he is cured. And we don't hear cured in this disease at all. I've never heard anybody who said they were actually cured, some people functioning.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think cure and remission can certainly be used in a number of patients. If the remission is long enough, then the patient is cured. Just like what we see in cancer and lymphomas. Yeah, you exceed a certain number of years, then I think the disease is pretty much gone. There could be a little bit of virus left in the body, but it shouldn't cause any problems.
Tell us about your son. How old was he when he came down with CFS?
My son, I realized he was sick at age 17, but he had 2 episodes of infections. That's why to this day I remember these things. At age 4, he had dark circles around his eyes, and he looked very, very tired for 2-3 months. Nobody could figure out what he had. It went away. Then he developed a little bit of this exercise-induced asthma, but he was functioning, he was normal. And age 16, he developed a severe respiratory illness. And he had fevers and severe asthmatic bronchitis. And within a short time, he developed pneumonia, shaking chills. And after that, about several weeks later, he stopped playing tennis. He was on the varsity tennis team. He stopped running. The only thing he did was break dance for an hour in school. Then he came home, he had to sleep for 5-6 hours. In the morning, he would fall asleep in classes. When I had him read a paragraph, he couldn't even remember what he read. And his grades dropped from straight A's down to C's and D's. He almost didn't make it out of high school. And in 1998, I diagnosed him because right before we moved to another house, I did his blood test. I just thought he was not looking good. He had these dark circles around his eyes. Then the next week, we moved to another house. He helped me to move a lot of boxes for the next 6 hours. The next 3 days, he just lay there on the mattress. He could not even get up. He couldn't even eat. We had to bring the food to him, prop him up, and feed him practically. He had a low-grade fever, 99.8. He had a very red throat. He had these lymph nodes in his neck. Then for the first time, I realized my son has this, which I probably was in denial for the previous year because I was so busy seeing patients. And I said, my son probably will never have this.
Were you seeing CFS patients?
Absolutely.
You already had a specialty?
Yes, yes. Since early 90s, I was seeing these patients because my partner actually wrote an article on the role of Epstein-Barr virus in this disease. And then all of a sudden, we were flooded with patients. And it turned out that was the wrong virus.
And you've done a study of viruses yourself. Do you think or believe you know the virus that causes CFS?
In some ways, a lot of things come with what we call serendipities. The week after I realized my son was ill, I received the blood test back. He had 2 viruses. Antibody tests are above the ceiling. So I recall then, 4 years old, he had an illness. 16 years old, he had another illness. This must be the 2 viruses he had. That was an assumption at that time. But from that point on, we have never given up. We've proven these viruses can persist in the body. You can solicit inflammatory responses, and it won't go away until we.
Can you identify which viruses?
Well, for enteroviruses, we started with antibody testing. So we can identify 6 Coxsackie virus type B, and we can identify 5 of the echoviruses. But there are 26 echoviruses, and there's more than 70 types of enteroviruses by antibody tests. We can't do them all. And now by gene tests, the sequence of the RNA, the 119 viruses now. The more and more than we can actually figure it out.
What would your advice to a physician encountering CFS for the first time? I will tell you that I know some physicians socially, and they don't know anything about it. In fact, some of them think it is a psychological, not a physical disease.
I think because of my son's illness, I think one thing I learned was, number one, you believe in your patient. You have to believe you're a patient. We do have a few bad apples sometimes, like they're faking it or do something for a secondary gain. That's exceedingly rare, maybe 1 or 2 out of 3,000 people. The great majority of people have actually no incentive for faking this illness. This is a real illness. It's just the doctors don't understand it. What is the saying? Your brain cannot understand. Your eyes cannot see what your brain does not understand. That's actually how it is. I often give the analogy to my patients. I said, well, if I get up in the middle of the night, I couldn't sleep. I look in the direction of Mars, and I said I can't see Mars, and Mars does not exist. Well, maybe I didn't bring a powerful telescope. That's how we have to look at these. These things are microscopic.
You are not using Ampligen, which is one of the sort of more controversial, but one of the obvious treatments for CFS or potential treatments. It's only not been approved by the FDA yet as of this recording. What do you do for your patients? What drugs do you use for them? What therapies do you recommend? What ways of life do you come up with?
First of all, I was offered as a study site for Ampligen because of my prior experience has not been favorable. I decided not to do it and focus on other things. I think the first thing we do in evaluating this illness, after believing the patient, you have to sort out what viruses can do this. A small minority of the patients actually has, like say, shingles. That started off this whole process. A young lady that was 50 years old, executive at Northrop, and had pain over here for almost 11 months. And she was totally bedridden, had cognitive dysfunction. She couldn't work for 9 months. And she came to see me. I did all the blood tests on her, and I thought she was a little crazy too. This is 15 years ago. At the 11th month, 2 little blisters showed up at the area of the pain. And I gave her simple drug like Excicavir. In 3 weeks, she was back to full-time work. Totally normal person. We've seen 45, 50 cases of that out of 3,000 patients. So we look for those first. There are a few cases of chlamydia pneumonia we can treat, but unfortunately, the great majority of the patients are due to enteroviruses. That's hard because...
Define those for our viewers.
Enteroviruses, as you know, that there are 3 polioviruses. Polioviruses don't do this. It's an acute infection. These other viruses, the cousins, actually not only can cause acute infections, sometimes it starts out with a very simple respiratory illness, gastrointestinal illness. Sometimes it can become a brain infection, heart infection, continued gastrointestinal infection, hepatitis, muscle infections. Then the symptoms of chronic fatigue syndrome will follow. These viruses are very wise. They not only can cause severe infections, but they can also survive inside the cells, like weeds. When weeds show up, initially a seed drops down in the soil. Then the weed will grow up. Then it will form many, many more seeds. Will drop back into the soil. Has anybody cured weeds? Even if you pull out the weeds and the roots, there's still the seeds. That's why they come back. We already discovered what these viruses do. They form this double-stranded RNA in the cells. That's the seeds. Okay.
Can we just go back to my question? A general practitioner, get somebody who's a good physician, listens, takes time, assuming all the virtues that you hope that a physician has, assuming that somebody comes in with this disease, is tired, has headaches, cannot function, any exercise, they collapse. What is the first step that physician should do? Because it seems to me that we need in this business not only to stimulate research, but also to educate many physicians who simply do not know the disease.
Right. Absolutely. One of the first things that physicians should do is stop telling the patient to go exercise. This is one disease you cannot exercise. If the patient's telling you, if I went out to walk 2 blocks and I would basically be in bed for a week, and the patient was a marathon runner 10 years before, I think we'll be a little foolish telling the patient to go exercise. So pacing is helpful in that sense, but pacing does not cure the disease. You just basically trying to avoid what we call aggravation of, aggravating the virus.
What would the physician who doesn't know the disease, what should that physician do?
You basically tell the patient, you don't exercise, you only do as much as you can tolerate. If you went out and walked 2 blocks, you're in bed for the next 2 days. You don't do that. Maybe you should try 1 block. Or maybe you should do some stretching, things like that to keep your muscle tones. That would be the number one thing to do, because we've seen too many patients got worse because they're forced into a physical therapy program, exercise, etc. So don't tell the patient to do that first.
We are in a society, doctor, that believes that everything can be cured with diet and exercise.
Dieting can be helpful in some respects. In this disease, some people do become very hypersensitive to certain food items. For instance, gluten. Even though the gene for celiac sprue is 1 in 300 people, people do become hypersensitive to gluten. So they can take the gluten out of the diet. Some people say, I'm a little more sensitive to dairy or sugar. They can do an elimination diet. I wouldn't go crazy on this type of things. But some patients get some benefit, mostly the gastrointestinal symptoms, but not the fatigue and the body aches.
I'm talking with Dr. John Chia, the iconic physician in Torrance, California, whose son survived CFS and is now functioning 100%. We will be back with more of this conversation on another episode of MECFS Alert. Thank you, Doctor.
If you would like to sponsor MECFS Alert, please contact us at mecfsalert@gmail.com. Help us to help you.